and I'm your co-host for the evening. Welcome. So please tell us where you're from when you come in. Just type in your name in the chat box and where you're coming from. I'm streaming live from Atlanta, Georgia.
Ah,
Yes.
I used to live near Atlanta, just south of the airport.
And yes, Rosalind is in Virginia and Cheryl is in Northern Virginia. We also have Erica on the phone, online, and she is coming from California. That's amazing. So, if you would just type your name and where you're from, but we also like for you to type your questions or any comments in the chat box, and we will get to you. And we have an amazing speaker tonight. Cheryl is coming to us from Northern Virginia. I'm excited to hear your story, Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to encourage people tonight. Mental illness is so difficult and it's so hard to watch family members go through this, but we can do it.
Yes.
Thank
Now
you.
we're gonna.
Yeah. I'm hope mental illness is so difficult and it's so hard to watch family members go through this, but we can do it.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
we're gonna.
Okay, so we are now streaming live on Facebook. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the pressing room. We are excited to have you all tonight to join us on this very important topic this evening. Welcome, welcome, welcome as people are joining us this evening. I am here in the pressing room with my co-host. Janice, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Janice Cooks, and I'm streaming from Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Welcome. I'm Rosalind Frazer-Gregory, the host and founder of The Pressing Room. I'm also the author of Save, Single, and Pregnant, an Amazon #1 best-selling ebook, A Beginner's Guide to Giving an Effective Testimony. I'm also a life coach, the owner and founder of At Last, I'm Free Coaching Services. Just to give you a little background on The Pressing Room, the Pressing Room was founded in November of 2020 when the Lord gave me the inspiration to create a platform where people can come and share their story of struggle and resilience. What I do want you to know about the Pressing Room is that we are not here to re-traumatize our guests as they share their story of struggle. We are here to learn from their experiences, as well as to encourage you all to let you know that no matter what it is that you're going through in this life, guess what? You can make it. It may seem very dark. It may seem like it will never end, but you can make it. So just to share a little bit about the format of the Pressing Room, once again, the Pressing Room is a platform that globally seeks to bring people together to strengthen each other as they share their story of struggle and resilience. Everyone experiences challenges. Nonetheless, all in the Pressing Room come out on top. So the format this evening will follow as such. We'll introduce our guests. Our guests will have 20 minutes to share their uninterrupted story of struggle and resilience. After our guest has shared completely, then we will start with my co-host and I asking questions for a deeper dive. And then, of course, we will open it up for our viewing audience to ask questions. Now, one thing I can tell you all that our guest knows that you all will be asking questions. So our guest is really expecting and wanting and welcoming questions tonight, because the whole idea is to educate and to engage with the audience. One thing that is different about the platform that I've heard that our viewers like is the fact that there is engagement and you have the opportunity to ask questions about what it is that you want to know, not necessarily what I want to know. I want to know what I want to know. That's why I asked the question. Janice want to know what she want to know. That's why she asked the question. So what is it that you want to know? Please ask the question. You have different mediums in which you can ask your question tonight. Certainly you can raise your hand. You can press at the bottom of your screen. You can press the reactions button and raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask your question. Or you can text me. If you have my telephone number, you can go ahead and text me and type in whatever question that you want to ask. If you are too shy to ask here. And also we are streaming live on Facebook. So for our audience on Facebook, you also will type your questions or your comments in the chat, and my co-host Janice Cooks will read your questions here to Cheryl. All right, we stopped streaming live on Facebook at 8:30 so that we can dismiss those of you who want to be dismissed at 8:30 because we try to be respectful of the hour. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started this evening. Let me introduce our guest. Our guest tonight is Cheryl Krichbaum.
Very good.
Cheryl is a speaker and award-winning author of her memoir, which is titled ReTested: The Story of a Post-Abortive Woman Called to Change the Conversation. You may have heard it said that you can't have a testimony without a test. For Cheryl, that test is defined by her siblings' schizophrenia, siblings, plural, a test that Cheryl keeps retaking. In her memoir, Cheryl shows how she responded to her siblings' schizophrenia at 3 significant times in her life, and ultimately learned how to respond in a thriving way without stressing out or neglecting her own needs. Tonight, we are going to hear Cheryl's thoughts on how to respond while caring for mentally ill family members. Ladies and gentlemen in the pressing room, help me welcome Cheryl Krichbaum as she shares her story, ReTested by Family Mental Illness. Welcome, Cheryl, to the pressing room.
Well, thank you, Rosalind. It really, truly is an honor to be here. And you're doing amazing work. And I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right, so to tell you my story, I'm going to read excerpts from my book, ReTested, to give you some context. Clearly, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. It's only 300 pages, but we'll do parts of it anyway, kind of give you the gist of being tested by family mental illness. So I start off in the beginning of the book with this. Nancy paced back and forth, 3 feet this way, 3 feet that way. She was talking to someone, but no one was there. Her words were unintelligible, but she seemed to enjoy her conversation. About every other turn, 3 feet this way, 3 feet that way, she would laugh. Then she saw me watching her from the kitchen door, and her face sank for a moment, but only a moment. She went back to pacing, talking to no one, listening and laughing. If I weren't so disturbed by her behavior, I'd be happy that she was happy. Her delusions were better than her reality. Whatever conversation she was having was better than being left by her husband, better than being a single mother of a toddler, better than living with her parents in their worry, and better than living in the same house as her little sister, whose life she envied. I'm the little sister. Nancy, my big sister, the one I used to look up to, the one with whom I used to share a room, the one who used to have all the wise answers to my annoying little sister questions, was insane. I know we don't use that word anymore, but it seems perfectly accurate. Her behavior was something out of a movie, a stereotype for people in an insane asylum. Nancy was 24, slim, about 5'4", just a little shorter than my 5'6". Her arms were always bent and her hands were always stressed. Her shoulder length hair was only curly because she got her hair permed. I was 16 when Nancy moved back into our house, a 3-bedroom lower level apartment in our duplex, which was a big old farmhouse in a small town in Minnesota. My world was shaken. I was the youngest. I am the youngest. When I was done with 3rd grade, Nancy graduated from high school and moved out to go to college just 15 minutes away. And when I was done with 5th grade, Paul, my big brother, graduated from high school and moved to Boston to go to college. And all through my 6th through 9th grade years, I felt like I was an only child. I enjoyed having my parents all to myself. We'd laugh at dinner. We enjoyed our 2 dogs. We split up the chores. We coordinated calendars to make sure everyone got to their rehearsals and concerts and genealogy meetings on time, since we only had 1 car. And we were just busy enough to enjoy life, but not overly stressed. At Christmas time, in the middle of my 10th grade year, Nancy moved back into my parents' house with her 6-month-old baby boy. Her husband had left her. He left her because he couldn't handle her mental illness, whatever it was. We didn't know what was wrong, and the doctors didn't know either. They diagnosed her with one mental illness after another, requiring different medications over the next few years, and finally landed on the diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, sometime after I graduated from high school. And it took years to get the correct diagnosis. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 5, which is often called the DSM-5, says that schizophrenia includes delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, and grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior. And that's exactly what I saw in Nancy's behavior. I don't want to capitalize the word schizophrenia. I don't want to give it much importance because I hate it, but it is important because schizophrenia does not just affect my sister, it affects my whole family. All right, so that's the first part of my story. Basically, when I was a teenager, I felt neglected. At the end of my high school years, because my parents were so focused on my sister, and rightfully so, they should have been, and taking care of my nephew, because my sister was not, and she wasn't really, she was in and out of being capable of taking care of my nephew. And so my parents' focus was completely on that situation, and I got ignored. You know, I went from the spoiled youngest to the spoiled only to the middle neglected child. And as a result, I went into retreat, basically, to get through all of this. I avoided being in my parents' house. I hated being at the dinner table. I ended up finding a boyfriend, or he found me, I'm not quite sure. And I spent all my time at his place studying rather than studying at home. I was a complete nerd. So yes, I was studying. But it's also not too surprising that I ended up pregnant. So we had a pregnant teenager in the house. That's me. Plus my mentally ill sister. And then by that time, my nephew was a toddler in the house with both of my parents working. And I felt completely justified in having an abortion. I mean, there was already too much stress in the house. We didn't need anything more. And really my decision was between abortion and putting the child up for adoption. And abortion just seemed easier. And so I had an abortion. And that was the end of my junior year in high school. And as soon as high school was done, I was out of there. I couldn't wait to get out of that house. So the guy that I was dating in high school, I ended up marrying him. And all through our marriage, I would avoid going home, which was challenging because that's where his family was from too. We lived about an hour and a half away from my parents and his parents. And of course, if we went to visit one, we had to go visit both. And our parents all knew each other. So, you know, there wasn't any keeping secrets about going and visiting one parent and not the other. So I described this time period in my life as avoiding the mental illness that my family was dealing with, retreating, escaping, surviving. That was my way of dealing with it. But I ended up getting divorced and met another guy who paid attention to my feelings. He even said, "Someone's been ignoring your feelings." And I know he was referring to my ex, but it was also true of my parents because they were so busy, and of me because I learned to stuff all of my feelings. And I wasn't paying attention to how I felt. And I wasn't letting myself feel my feelings. I was just pushing them all down. So this guy's name is Russ. He went to church. He went to a church small group, and I had no idea what a small group was, and I was not going to go. And eventually, I did go to church with him. The way he treated me like somebody who was important. He didn't condemn me for my abortion. He didn't condone it, but he didn't condemn me either. He made Jesus feel real to me, feel appealing to me. And so I ended up choosing a personal relationship with Christ. Now, I had grown up in church. My dad's choir director, my mom's the organist. We all sang, volunteered, did everything at church. So all growing up was there at least twice a week. But I didn't really know how to be friends with Jesus until I went to church with Russ. And Russ and I got married. All right, so then the next part of the story. So after we get married, my brother Paul started showing indications of mental illness. Now, he and I were not really friends growing up. I was the irritating little sister. So I was 7 years behind him in school, and he was my mysterious big brother. And then my sister, who's the oldest, she kind of acted like our second mom and both my brother, and I found that very irritating. But after my brother got married and I got married the first time, the four of us spent a whole bunch of time together. We did a bunch of double dates, like all the time, and really became friends. So, and then my brother would come and visit me at work because I worked at the University of Minnesota, and he's such a nerd. He super intelligent guy. He still does not have his bachelor's degree, but he knows Hebrew, Aramaic, Mandarin, and was doing PhD level work in computational linguistics. And so he would come find me while I was at work, and we would sit and talk. And when he went through his divorce and then I went through my divorce, we supported each other. So we really became good friends during the decade after I left my parents' house. But then after Russ and I got married, it became evident that things were not quite right with my brother. So here's another excerpt from the book. Paul's house went through foreclosure. He got some cash out of the deal and decided to travel. He packed up all his books in his car and started driving. I guess his car broke down in another state and he had to put his books into a storage unit, and somehow, and I don't remember the particulars, he made it back to Minneapolis. Paul found an apartment, but he never found a job, and I'm not sure he ever looked for a job. One day, Paul stopped by my house to visit and told me people were talking about him wherever he went. He described how he was in downtown Minneapolis near the courthouse, and a man was on his phone reporting to someone where Paul was. Another time he was on the bus and police were following him. Yet another time he was in a cafe and he said the same cars were driving by over and over. He even wrote down their license plate numbers. I told Paul that I was concerned about him. I didn't say that none of it sounded real, but none of it sounded real. He said, I'm concerned too. He meant he was concerned about his safety. I meant I was concerned about his mental state, but I didn't know how to express that without upsetting him. Paul's money ran out. He stopped paying the rent. And sometime in the spring after Russ and I got married, Paul was evicted. My mom and dad had split up by this time. Dad was living with his girlfriend. My mom was raising my nephew, who was a teenager by now. And Nancy had her own apartment, and all in all, she was doing pretty well. Russ and I, we love to go to movies. And one night I suggested a movie called A Beautiful Mind, thinking that it was an action flick. It's not an action movie. A Beautiful Mind is a story about John Forbes Nash Jr., a mathematical genius who won a Nobel Prize, and he also has schizophrenia. As soon as Nash's diagnosis was revealed, I started crying. Russ asked me if I wanted to leave. I said, no, I have to see how this ends. I cried through the rest of the movie. That was the first time I thought about what schizophrenia might be like for Nancy. I was just glad she didn't receive electric shock treatment like Nash did, because I used to do that back in the day. The scariest thing to me, though, was that Nash didn't remind me so much of Nancy. He reminded me of Paul. So it shortly became clear that Paul had a mental illness, and I was guessing it was schizophrenia, even though it seemed different than my sister. And I ended up taking a class from NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. And today that class is called NAMI Family Basics. You should be able to look it up. The class was taught by a couple who had an adult child with a mental illness, and everyone in the class had a family member with mental illness. We learned about all sorts of mental illnesses. We learned how to communicate with our family members. We learned what our rights were in light of mental health laws and HIPAA, which was new at the time. And what I remember most is that the doctors couldn't tell us much, if anything. However, we could tell them everything. And it was through that class that I became more and more concerned that Paul had schizophrenia. What I realized during this time is that when I was in high school and confronted with my sister's schizophrenia, I left the church. And I had a whole lot of church hurt. I felt like the church didn't help us. They didn't help my dad. My mom and I even convinced my dad to quit his job as church choir director, because church was stress rather than love and support. That's the way it felt, at least in high school. I don't think that's what they intended, but that's the way it felt. And so this time around, I was like, not doing that again. I'm not going to walk away from the church. I'm basically going to go to the church and say, look, I need help, and I'm not going to do this anonymously. And a lot of wonderful things happened as a result of that, but it was all my initiative. I got help from our small group leader, because eventually I did get into a small group with my husband. We were up in the front of the church praying with people every Sunday. And, you know, I was really stressing out during this time. My reaction this time around was to worry. My brother was homeless. None of us could take him in, because then we knew we wouldn't be able to get him the help that he needed. It was difficult to keep in contact with him because, cell phones were fairly new. This is the early 2000s, and my brother's never been willing to carry a phone with him. And you know, I mean, it's very natural to worry. And then you add homelessness on top of it. And it was a very stressful time. I even went and found absolutely every single Bible verse that says, do not worry, to keep trying to convince myself not to worry. And so two significant things happened. One of the times when we were up praying with our pastor after church, he said, you know, when your brother gets to heaven, he's not going to be able to point to you and say, Cheryl didn't do this or Cheryl didn't do that. He's responsible for himself. And that was a big aha for me. And it's interesting, I had gone and gotten counseling for myself to help me handle all of this. And my counselor was telling me that. He's like, you know, you're not the oldest, you're the youngest. And I'm like, okay, but I act like the oldest, and the oldest has a mental illness herself. And he said, you know, your parents are really responsible for this. I'm like, yes, but my parents are divorcing. My mom's raising a teenager and taking care of her elderly mother. My dad's working, both my parents are working. My dad's coming down to the Twin Cities, an hour and a half drive to meet with my brother once a week as it is. I mean, I'm the one who's nearby. But what my pastor said really made me realize that I was carrying a burden that I wasn't supposed to be carrying, that it really was my brother's responsibility because he's an adult. And then the other thing that I realized from reading Bible passages was from Matthew 6:33, that if I focus on the Lord, then and put my focus there first, I won't be as worried. And so I started practicing that. And in that, so I describe that time in my life as striving to fix, trying to fix all the situations that were going on, just trying to fix my brother's homelessness situation, trying to fix how my parents responded, how my family responded. That was the burden that I was carrying at that time. And then God just turned things around and pretty much made me focus on my own family, because I got pregnant with my first boy, and I had to focus at home. And then my brother eventually was picked up by the police, taken to the hospital, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and had a housing situation. So we had food, shelter, clothing, and we knew where he was. And then I was dealing with my own life of being married and having kids, moving across the country, because we moved from Minneapolis to Atlanta to here outside of Washington, D.C. So then you got to fast forward again for the third event. So we're living out here in Virginia, and I get a phone call, this is 5 years ago, from my dad saying that my brother had disappeared. And we didn't know for a while where he went. And eventually we figured out that my brother went back to Boston, near where he went to college. And so we had let the police there know. We had filed a missing persons report. The police actually had a conversation with my brother. And so my dad was able to find out the homeless shelter that he was staying at. He left a message, and my brother basically left. And the guess is that he got the message and said, I don't want anybody to know where I am. So he left Boston. So then we figure out that he's in Washington, D.C., which we all thought was really weird. Why was he in Washington, D.C.? Because once he became mentally ill, he no longer wanted to be friends with me. He avoided me. He only showed up to family events because my parents brought him. He didn't respond to anything. So we went from being really good friends to I was rejected by him. And so then he's out here in Washington, D.C., and my mom lives with me. And so it's like, I don't really think he'd seek her out either. So it was really weird that he's in Washington, D.C. And then we lose track of him, and we don't know where he is for, I think it was a year, maybe even longer. And then I got a phone call that I thought was a telemarketer that turned out to be a social worker at a mental health hospital. She was trying to find my mom, but she had my mom's first name and my married name and had put those two together. And so it was like, who's on the phone, you know? And found out that she was trying to find my mom because my brother was at the hospital, and they were trying to figure out next steps for releasing him. And so, of course, we're all crying because we finally know where my brother is. And so that started, this was 3 years ago, and that started yet another long story, long process. But this time I was much more mature in the Lord. I knew, you know, when I was first going through this with my brother back in Minneapolis, I could look up Bible verses. Now, pretty much have them memorized, read practically every story in the book. And I had this task of going and picking up my brother and taking him to get his eyes checked so that he could get glasses, because he's got pretty bad eyesight and he loves to read. And so we had worked out with the hospital that I would take him to an optometrist to get the prescription, because that would go faster. The whole process would go faster. And everyone's concerned. My parents are concerned. I'm concerned because my brother really doesn't respond well to me. But I was determined. And I also knew that if I focused on the Lord, I'd be okay. But then I'm driving into DC. So it's like an hour plus drive. And I've got my worship music going. And all of a sudden, I remember this Bible story, Old Testament Bible story about King Jehoshaphat. He was the king of Judah. He was about to be attacked from all enemies on all sides, and he was freaking out. And he prayed and asked the Lord for help. And then he gathered the whole nation to pray. And God gave them confidence that it was going to be okay, and told them to go out and face the enemies. But God basically said, I'll take care of it. So they did this really weird thing in that they sent a worship band out ahead of their army. And then the enemies they all attacked each other instead of attacking King Jehoshaphat and Judah. And the people of Judah were thanking God ahead of the battle, that as if it was already won. And of course, they praised him all through the battle. And then they praised him after the battle because they survived. And I realized I'm listening to singing this worship music on the way into Washington, D.C. And I'm like, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm sending worship ahead of this spiritual battle. And I became much more calm, much more in tune with the Lord, and started praying differently, as if the whole day was accomplished. And it ended up being an absolutely amazing day. I was supposed to spend about an hour with my brother. I spent the whole day with my brother. I took him out to eat twice. He talked to me. He laughed. I reminded him of stories from growing up, and he enjoyed that. I told him about a dream that I had about him. We grew up canoeing. So Minnesota doesn't have just 10,000 lakes. It has a couple hundred rivers, and we used to canoe on all those rivers. So I'm telling him about this dream of canoeing on a river, and I'm like, but it was going the wrong direction, I think. But you know this river better. It was actually a creek. You know it better than me, you know. And so we discussed which way. And so he enjoyed correcting me and getting all of that. And we ended up having a really pleasant day. And I asked him, I said, do you think we could be friends again? And he said, it's possible, with kind of a half smile. And then his social worker told me that he was smiling, which totally blew me away. And that was the thing that really changed my perspective and made me realize that in all things in life, if I'm focusing and praising on the Lord, I'm calm and things go better. And I say more of the right words, and people respond better. And it's just made a big, huge difference in my life, in all areas of my life. And I'm sure you can imagine that that was not the last test that I've had. So I have been practicing this for the last 3 years. And once again, not just with my brother's situation, but with all things in life. And I love it so much that I am constantly telling people, you know, when we focus up, then we can focus out and get things done without stressing out.
Awesome. Sounds like it's like a lot of stress
Mm-hmm.
that was brought into your life as well as your family's life. So
Yeah.
I can hear the different stressors and how you all were all impacted individually. You said something, Cheryl, that I want to start off with, and I think it's very important. I was just reading about it, so it really stuck out to me when you said it, but you were talking about responsibility.
Mm.
Others taking responsibility for themselves and recognizing that it takes first of all, it takes a mature individual to release people to be self-actualized, to make decisions about their own life, to deal with consequences that come out of the decisions that we make. It takes a mature person to not have to control the outcome or another person's decisions for their life. It also takes a mature person to not have to know what's best for you.
Right.
So you can make decisions for you, and I can be okay with the decisions that you make for you because I got to make decisions for me. My question is, that's very hard because a lot of us, we feel like I gotta be in there and because I love them.
Right.
But my question for you, Cheryl, is what was it like to release the responsibility of your brother?
So, you know, everything's a process. It's not like it happens like that, right? So when my pastor said that to me, that was a huge aha for me. And I felt a burden lifted off of my shoulders, but I knew that I still felt some of the burden. I hadn't let it completely go. And I have learned with all sorts of situations that, you know, I'll give things up and then I'll try and take them back.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll give them up again and try and take them back. So I have to give the thing up until I really give the thing up. And then it really is a release. And it's, there have been other situations where it's actually been physical, where I could feel the stress in primarily my shoulders, because that's where I hold my stress. Stretching wasn't helping. I was going to the chiropractor all the time. But when I actually gave it up, I didn't even have to go to the chiropractor anymore. It's like it physically left my body. So it's just this nice big release and light feeling.
Wow. Thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned the stress showing up in your body, because stress manifests in so many different ways, but through somatic symptoms in different areas of our body. And when we think that we're loving somebody so much that I have to stay here, or they're not going to make it.
Right.
But the truth is, they're really responsible for their own life. And you can do yourself a great big favor by letting people live their lives. And it doesn't mean that you don't love them. I see Ingrid's hand is raised. Ingrid, please, if you can tell us, number one, where you're streaming from, and also please ask your question or make your comment. Please unmute
Thank
yourself.
you, Ms. Rosalind. I am streaming from the DC metro area. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing your story. The episode with your pastor, I mean, immediately I thought mean pastor, insensitive pastor.
Oh.
But your perspective has really helped to equalize my thoughts very quickly, because it is, and I think both you and Rosalind just touched on the importance of making sure that we do not enable, and at least easing up some of the assistance we provide to those who endure such unfortunate, but God always has a greater plan of why things are the way that they are. But easing up the hovering and the helicoptering per se over those who endure the journey that they've been dealt. And again, I thought mean pastor, insensitive pastor, but it takes wisdom to understand that it is very important that we allow the grace of God to be manifested in those who have the journey that has been set before them. And so I really thank you for your courage. I thank you for your endurance, and it's definitely a ministry. Everyone doesn't understand. And oftentimes, not to speak so much, but oftentimes those people, individuals who live a life of specialty or they have a special place in God's bosom, they are often forgotten or left to be despondent all by themselves. But sometimes I realize that God has given us the gift. He's given you the gift to have that compassion for your family members who are enduring the journey that they're on. And so I thank you so very much for sharing your journey. And I hope that folks who encounter you will learn something for their own journey, as well as they take care of people that they know who are enduring similar situations. So thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to be clear, I mean, there's not enough time to tell every detail, but my pastor knew the whole situation, and he was very caring during the whole thing. And I really think that was the Holy Spirit speaking through him, and he said it in a compassionate way. It was something that I needed to hear.
Right.
You know, that it wasn't that I was carrying a burden that I wasn't supposed to be carrying. Right.
Right.
And I know that, and you know, if you read my book, you'll get this message. I know that this is the Lord training me, that he has used my sibling's schizophrenia to train me, because he's called me to talk about the abortion issue, which everybody has an opinion about. And, you know, it can be very challenging to speak about that topic. And so this whole schizophrenia thing really has trained me to get through all circumstances. And also just to say, there's so many people involved in the care for the mentally ill, and so many laws that are both helpful and harmful, and they're there for a reason. I have had to learn to trust the Lord through taking care of my brother. You know, it was 3 years ago we got that phone call. My brother's been homeless and disappeared more than once since then. Medical emergencies seems to be how we find out where he is. It has been very scary. And it's been very sad, especially recently, honestly. And yet I can see the Lord working through all of it. And I realize that, you know, my job is to do what I can to help my brother without enabling my brother. And that's a tricky balance.
Tricky balance, very tricky balance. Thank you. Janice, do you have a question, please?
Yes, I do. I can appreciate your story. It was hitting home in a whole lot of areas. My mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
So,
Sorry.
so as a child, you know, I just felt, you know, unloved, not knowing that there was a mental illness there. She, you know, was a lot of things going on, you know, with the drinking and all that stuff. So I can appreciate that from a child, your perspective, a sibling. But I have a question though, because there are people out here who have siblings and parents that have mental illness. I know you've been in it for a while, so I'm curious to know, what are some of the coping skills you could share with us tonight that people can maybe take and use? Because that's the hardest thing, you know, you either become an enabler, or some people just wash their hands of their family members. So I'm curious, what are some coping skills we can use if we're dealing with family?
All right. So the first thing I recommend is getting yourself educated about mental illnesses in general, about the laws, and that NAMI Family Basics class is a great place to do it. And honestly, I haven't checked it out here. I mean, it's been 20 years and it was in Minneapolis when I did that. But NAMI is nationwide. So it's worth looking up, calling them, finding out about the Family Basics class and getting yourself enrolled. It's totally worth your time. I do think it's really important to know the laws. Before HIPAA, it was very difficult because, well, for example, out here, my brother's had a number of medical crises. The doctors can call and contact my parents and get them to override my brother's refusal for care for his physical issues, but they can't for mental health issues. And so that's there for historical reasons, because our ancestors did really bad things, especially during the Great Depression, where they were putting family members into psych hospitals because they couldn't feed them. And so all these laws resulted. And so if you have an adult family member, you have no rights unless that adult family member gives you rights. So neither my sister nor my brother have ever given anybody rights to work with their providers. And then you add HIPAA on top of it, and the entire medical field is afraid to talk to you for fear that they're going to get sued or get fired or whatever, which is really frustrating, because we can tell the mental health providers information about our family member, and who knows them best? We do. Who knows their history? Who knows what they were like when they were healthy? Hopefully somebody who's still alive. And they get what, an hour once a week, if you're lucky. But getting them to call you and talk to you is like pulling teeth. So, you know, I have to spend time doing healthy things for myself. You know, I mean, it's so easy to go to drinking. It's so easy to go to some other self-medication, sugar, you know. We got to remember to do healthy things for ourselves. And for me, it's often worshiping. And then I'm a writer. So, you know, if I can bury myself in writing, that makes me very happy.
Cheryl, I want to ask you something and just kind of give clarity to our viewing audience, because with me working in the mental health field and knowing that there are times that you see concerning behaviors at home, concerning behaviors in the street, and you're seeing symptomatic behaviors active at the time, and then you call the police or you call the crisis center, and they take them to the place where they get assessed, and then they're released, and everybody scratches their head and say, how could they be released? Like, you professionals are crazy, like, what are you doing? But then we say they deny that they're a threat to themselves or to others. And because they are not a threat to themselves or others, there's no ground to keep them, which is very frustrating for the layman. But please speak to that, because that is a real reality.
Oh my, yes. Okay. Okay, being a danger to somebody else, if you can see that, that's actually much easier to start the commitment process. Being a danger to yourself, if you're suicidal, that's easy. Neither one of my siblings have ever been suicidal. They're neglectful of themselves. And as a result, they end up having consequences. And that's most obvious with my brother and having medical crises since he's been out here in DC. But even, okay, so, all right, this is a hot spot for me, Rosalind. I'm just warning you. All right, so this last time around, we were told that the doctors said that he's not a danger to himself. And I nearly launched through the phone because I don't want to give away my brother's current state, but it is just absolutely obvious that he is in the situation that he's in right now because he neglected himself. And so it sounds like if I had a whole lot of money, I would call up a lawyer and have a serious talk about suing. But even if they were to say that my brother is a danger to himself and start the commitment process, that commitment process is only good for a year. And so what happens is they get him on meds, they get him stable, and he really isn't a danger to himself. Legally, they have to let him out of that commitment, and they will set him up as best as they possibly can. I mean, in Minnesota, he had a social work team working with him. He was in an apartment. Things seemed to be, I almost said going great. They were never going great because he's always had hallucinations. But they were going better. And he still walked away. So, you know, everybody has their hands tied. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Everybody has their hands tied. And if I really thought that my brother being committed this time around was going to make a difference, I would pursue it. But it's already proven not to work here in DC. We've been through this cycle at least 3 times. So I keep talking about winning the lottery and taking HIPAA down, and then going after the mental health laws and saying, look, dudes, this isn't working. But I also know that, okay, so my brother has a guardian, and he's a lawyer, and this guardian has more than one person that he's guardian for. And one of the things that he said to me more than once, he says, it's very nice to work with a family who works with me. So he doesn't experience that very often. And the other thing he said is mental illness tends to run in the family. So you can imagine that my interactions with family is often very difficult, which I totally get. as well. And knowing how emotional we have all been over the last 30-ish years, you know, if I wasn't in a good place, this would be really difficult for my brother's guardian to work with us. But it's because I've been able to get myself into a healthy state myself, having my head straight myself, that I'm actually better able to help my brother by helping my guardian or his guardian, you know, the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I praise you for being in that field. We need you. You know, I can't even imagine where my sister and brother would be if there weren't people doing what you do. But I also know that we all have our hands tied.
Mm-hmm. Let me just open it up to the audience. Does anyone in the audience have a question or comment for Cheryl? Please unmute yourself.
Hey, Miss Cheryl, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. I can totally relate. I have a diagnosis myself with bipolar, and it runs in my family. And I'm like the rebel because for years growing up, it was always denial that there was something going on in the family. And as I entered into the medical field myself and started learning things, I pretty much self-diagnosed and took myself in for treatment. And NAMI is an awesome place because I've been to one of their classes trying to get my mom to go to understand me and what I was going through, and possibly essentially getting her to admit her own issues. But she's in denial. And one of the points that you made about sending the praise before the issue and letting God do his thing, that was like an aha moment for me, because I struggle with trying to help my mom as I'm awake to my issues and I know her issues. So it's like I can't change her. She's almost 80. I can't, so all I can do is like send the praise before me and ask the Lord for strength to help me to be able to deal with her. So I thank you for that. And I commend your strength.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I have to
Let me
commend.
jump in for 1 sec. Let me jump in for one
Okay.
second. We running over, and I try to be respectful of our audience's time at 8:30. So again, we want to thank you. We want to hear from you, Cheryl. I know that you're doing some amazing things. So please, if you can just, before our audience leave and we stop streaming live on Facebook, if you can just tell us about your book and any other ventures that you're currently involved in.
All right. So as I said, all this working with mental illness is really training for what the Lord has really called me to do, which is to change the conversation about abortion. And so far I have 2 books. I know I have at least 2 more coming. And I just want to start off by saying that I don't talk politics, because what the Lord has called me to do is not about politics. It's about changing hearts, and not through guilt, but through love. And so the first 2 books that the Lord told me to write, I haven't written, but they will tell other people's stories. It actually started off, I thought it was telling other women's stories, but I've had some men who have taken girlfriends to the abortion facility or pressured them or whatever, volunteer to tell their stories as well. So those are coming. But the Lord said that before I could write anybody else's story, I had to write my own. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one that you've been hearing about. That's ReTested. And I felt really good because I won a couple finalist awards. And one of them I lost to the Pope. And so it's like, okay, I'm okay with taking second place to the Pope. Anyway, so that's ReTested. That's my story. And so it's both about mental illness and about my abortion story. And then the other one is a prayer guide, Worship to End Abortion. And so once again, it's taking that idea of sending worship ahead of things. And once again, not political. Nothing in here is political except for the introduction that says, I hate politics. All right. So those are the two that I have out so far. And then I will also be releasing online sex education courses later this summer, because you can't talk about abortion without talking about sex. And so those are going at the issue of sex from every angle that the Lord gives me, including neuroscience. So the neuroscience, the social sciences, the biology, the whole deal. And so I've got some of it online and ready to go now, but I'll have a big release at the end of the summer. So right now I've got for tweens first, that was my first go, and then teenagers. And then I intend to have one for, you know, that post high school time period before we get married. So that's what I'm up to.
That's what you're up to. You're busy. So you made room to come see about little old us here in the pressing room. After all, you're in competition with the Pope. Like, wow, impressive. So Cheryl, I know that you have agreed to gift 2 of your books tonight. So your book ReTested. So part of that is your story, memoir of you dealing with abortion as well as with mental illness. So would you please, the pressing room, we're moving up in the world. We are want to always celebrate and acknowledge our authors and give them an opportunity to spread their wings here. So please, if you would just, from the list to the right of all of our participants, if you can just select any name that you would like to gift this book to.
Oh, you want me to choose?
I want you to choose.
She's putting me to work. All right. How about Lucinda?
Lucinda. All right. So Lucinda was selected to receive the book ReTested tonight. So what we will do is we will, Lucinda will give me her address, and I will forward that on to you, and you can get it out to Lucinda. Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you very much, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
All right, awesome. So of course, you all know at 8:30, we always try to be respectful of your time. Thank you for holding on just a little bit longer so we can get that out. But we will go ahead and stop streaming live on Facebook. And we will continue on here in the Zoom room. So just let me do my wrap up. I'm Rosalind Frazer-Gregory, the host and founder of The Pressing Room. I'm also the author of Save Single and Pregnant, an Amazon #1 best-selling ebook, A Beginner's Guide to Giving an Effective Testimony. I want to thank you all so much for joining us here in the pressing room. We are always looking for speakers to tell their story of struggle and resilience. We are always looking for authors and entrepreneurs. If you know any, please give them my telephone number or my email, or pass the flyer on to them, and I'll be happy to connect with them so we can make room for them here in the pressing room. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Cheryl, please remain here in the Zoom room, and we'll stop streaming live on Facebook. Thank you for those of you on Facebook. You're welcome to jump on into the Zoom room, or good night, and thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Good night to those of you who are leaving. All right, so let me just again, before you, Cheryl, we already told that Janice had to leave, right? So she's already logged off.
Right.
I want to ask if there's anyone else in the pressing room that has a question or comment for Cheryl.
Can I respond first to the person who had the last comment?
Oh, go ahead.
All right. I'm sorry, I missed your name because I'm reading on the screen. My eyesight's not great. But first of all, I wanted to commend you for checking out, figuring things out for yourself and getting yourself help. That is huge. And most people who have some sort of diagnosis are unwilling to do that. One of the things with that NAMI class is that we went through all sorts of diagnoses to learn about them and kind of assess for our family member what it is that we thought that they had. And it really helped us to understand how there are, what's the right words? Symptoms or behaviors that are in more than one mental illness, show up in more than one mental illness. And then, you know, we all talk about how to communicate with our family members who have mental illnesses. And that's really challenging, especially when people are unwilling to consider that they may have one. And so I commend you hugely. And I totally understand about your mom's situation. My mom doesn't have mental illness, but she does have a lot of issues that I used to have. And it's really hard to talk to her in such a way that still honors her, because she's my mother, right? And we're called to honor our father and our mother, which doesn't mean that we allow people to hurt us if they've ever been hurtful. But it also means that we have to figure out how to talk to them in an honoring way, even when they're really frustrating us. So I just wanted to commend you for taking care of yourself and to caring enough about your mom to try and get her help as well. That's awesome.
Thank you, Miss Cheryl. My name is Erica, and yeah, that class was awesome, but sadly we never finished because I think the first class that we went to kind of opened a door that she wasn't ready to walk through.
Right.
And she just kind of like shied away from it, like, oh, I don't have time for that. It's tying up my weekend and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So, but here we are. That was like, I want to say maybe less than 10 years ago, maybe, or almost 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so I'm still dealing with my own issues and, you know, finding ways to cope and deal with her as she's aging.
Right.
Because it's becoming more difficult because I have an older sister, but I'm the one who has to, like, I'm in the medical field, so I truly understand, you know, the aging process, the mental illness side of things. And I take, you know, I have to take care of my mom, but she pushes me away so much and it's so hard for me. So it's like, okay, so that's why you've given me that gem to send the worship before the battle.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, because we're facing something right now with her physical body. And I'm like, okay, you know, so, and I'm away. I live in Los Angeles, but I'm a travel nursing assistant. So, and part of me being, part of me being away from home was that issue with my mom and some words being exchanged. And I'm like, okay, I need to honor my mom, but it's like I'm dealing with my childhood trauma and like being an adult and being subject to that same trauma. It's like, it's hurtful. And then I got to be there for my mom. So it's very challenging. So thank you for that so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Can I send you a book too?
Oh.
No, really. I mean, there are a lot of things that I learned. Well, okay, there's a huge one that I learned right when I met Rosalind about letting go of things so that I can think clearly. And I talk about it in the book, and I think that might help you. And then go read that Jehoshaphat story. It's in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 1 through 30. And, you know, before you start reading, I always say, Lord, open my mind to understanding the scriptures, which comes from Luke 24, 45, something like that. It's right at the end of Luke, where Jesus opens, the risen Jesus opens minds of the disciples so that they understand the scriptures. And so I pray that before I read, you know, ask the Holy Spirit to speak to you through that story, and maybe you'll get something awesome out of there that you can share with me.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you.
I'll get your address, Erica, and I'll give it to Cheryl. I wonder if there are any other questions from the viewing audience or comments for Cheryl. If so,
Yes.
unmute yourself.
Yes, Ms. Fraser. I'd like to say to Cheryl that my experience was similar to hers, but I was in the country. I was back on the islands, and I really didn't know what. But I remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I realized something is not right with my mother. And I thought, like Miss Cook said earlier, I thought my mother just didn't like me.
Yeah.
And it turned out my mother was never diagnosed. She was running in the neighborhoods and everybody on the street diagnosed her, but she was never professionally diagnosed.
Right.
My mother's, she's passed now, so I'm gonna say this. My mother's name was Mavis Turnbull. But if you go on the island and ask for Mavis Turnbull, no one know who you're talking about. But if you ask for Crazy Mavis,
Oh,
they know exactly who you're talking about. My mother passed now, and like you says, if someone said it runs in the family,
mhm.
well, I have a brother down there that's in St. Elizabeth Hospital, and I could see it in other family members. I first met this brother in 1988, and I met him in St. Elizabeth Hospital,
Oh, wow.
and he's still there now today.
Mhm.
I just
Wow.
want to say I see the resemblance in your situation, and I see it with other people that spoke, and I see it in my situation. I actually thought my mother didn't like me.
Right. So what islands? What are we talking about?
The Virgin Islands, St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And outside of the United States, well, okay. So I've been to one of the countries in Africa several times, and you know they wouldn't know what schizophrenia is, right? They would say that my siblings are demon possessed, you know. So it's looked upon differently in different countries, and different countries deal with it in different ways.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. I see here that Erica typed in the chat that people with mental illness are not crazy. Erica, do you want to comment on that? It sounds like you want to educate the audience.
I just think it's miseducation and ignorance of people, and they say that, you know, oh, they're crazy. Because even growing up, my great aunt, who is bipolar, and there was this term in our family. I don't even know if it was a real term or something they made up just to keep it, you know, like only the adults knew what it was. But they like, oh, she's acting cockgoo. And I'm like, what is that? But as I grew older and being the little black sheep of the family and the only one in the medical field, you know, at the time when she had like a comatose situation with her medication, they had to call me to the hospital. And I'm like, so what's going on? And they're like, oh, you know, she had lithium toxicity. Well, I was a lab assistant at the time drawing psych patients for lithium. And I'm like, why is she on a psychotropic drug? And then it was like you can hear a pin drop in the room because nobody wanted to open Pandora's box, if you will. And especially my mom, because my mom, like I said, she's in denial of her illness, which made her be in denial of mine. And I suffered so long, and I was crying out for help starting in my teenage years. And my mom would always tell me, you know, you're just crazy. Like my own mom would call me crazy. And it wasn't until I want to say 5 years ago that I had to tell my mom, I go, I'm not crazy. I said, and this will be the last time that I will allow you to call me crazy.
Yeah.
You know, and I had to address it respectfully, but I had to tell her, I said, you know, to me, crazy is being in denial and not getting help. And she like really like it hit home for her. And it seems like since that moment, we've been having some type of small change, but things are getting better.
If I can just jump in there, because you and Cheryl and Errol just spoke to some things that's very prevalent within, you will see with mental health clients, and you will see particularly with, there's a particular type of therapy that you can use with schizophrenics, as well as like people that suffer with depression. And a lot of it, what you will see that's problematic would be interpersonal relationships. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, not going all deep into the weeds, but with the growing process of not learning how to manage your feelings, your emotions per se, and subsequently they deal with their emotions from young in very negative, maladaptive ways, which pushes people away. And then as adults, as you grow, they stay in these places of isolation, they stay in the places of depression, they stay in places of anger. And the longer they stay there, the more maladaptive it becomes and more negative it becomes as it plays out with other people. And subsequently, you have these people or relationships, and we all have these kinds of issues, right? Where you have these difficult relationships going on, and it's just people not knowing how to, in a healthy way, deal with their emotions and deal with stress and things like that. Cheryl, what did it look like in your family growing up? The interpersonal conflicts that were happening, and a lot of it was stemming from stress, right?
Yeah. And, you know, until my sister was sick, I wouldn't have thought that we were bad at communicating. But now looking back at it, I'm like, oh yeah, we were not good at communicating before she got sick, and it just, you know, everything was escalated. And, you know, as a good Minnesotan, we were very passive aggressive and stoic, and you don't share your feelings. And then we're also talking about the 1980s, where you don't tell people that you've got a person in the family with a severe mental illness. So, you know, there was a whole lot of not talking about our feelings. I don't know that anybody in our family was good at talking to people without it sounding like we were blaming each other for things. So that was one of the things that I learned from that NAMI class, was learning how to talk without sounding accusatory in any way. And, you know, we didn't even realize we were doing it. I don't think that we intended to be accusatory. And that's really one of the hardest things to do is to not, it's so easy to blame the person who has the mental illness for their behavior. And I'm constantly reminding people, okay, but that's his mental illness that's making that happen. You know, that's not my brother, that's his mental illness that's talking. So, you know, I don't remember the specifics from the NAMI class, but I can't help but keep recommending that class because it made such a difference. I think, you know, the biggest thing is remembering who's responsible for what, for thinking about how your words sound to the other person, remembering that when you're dealing with the mentally ill person, that's being filtered through their mental illness. And so even with your best intentions, things will get misinterpreted. It happened to me just last week. So I went from having some favor with my brother for, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks to all of a sudden he's mad at me again. And I realized that I let my guard down and wasn't paying as close of attention to, and it was actually my behaviors, interactions with somebody else, but it's how he perceives things that got me into trouble, frankly. And so, you know, you're constantly filtering and trying to remember how to communicate with the mentally ill person. And it's going to be a little bit different with each person. Like, you know, talking to my sister is different than talking to my brother, right? I mean, with any diagnosis of anything, I mean, look at heart attacks. I mean, heart attacks happen differently for men than they do for women, right? I mean, everybody is individual. There are lots of different medications for heart disease because some people do well with one and don't do well with another, right? So we have to figure out how to communicate with the one individual person and then not take it personally. So like what happened on Friday, I didn't take it personally because I knew it was the mental illness, but I was sad and I let myself be sad. I just didn't let myself sit there and wallow in it. You know, I needed my time to be sad, but then I also needed to, you know, get back to praising the Lord so that I could, you know, I have other things going on in my life. And so we always, whatever it is that we're going through, we have to remember not to sit in it, not to sprint through it, because that was what my family was really good at growing up, sprinting through our healing, but to be walking through it. You know, it's got to be a healthy movement.
Wow. Cheryl, this is a very important topic and you've shared a lot. And Erica said, this is so good and very helpful. Praise God. And I would love to have some more questions and time with you. Janice had asked a question, but we are at the 9 o'clock hour and we have to be respectful of that. So we probably will have to have you back in the pressing room to continue on because so many of us have encounters either with family or friends or in the workplace or even ourselves have, you know, we're dealing with mental health issues. In some cases, they're undiagnosed and we just dismiss it as just that's how they are. They got a bad temper or, you know, whatever the term is that we use that nobody can figure out because it's a secret. And there's such a huge stigma that's attached to it as well. And it's so important to be able to talk about because the more we educate about this topic, the more people will seek help and get some intervention that will be helpful to them and help to mitigate some situations that, you know, doesn't have to blow up and get out of control. But anyway, we have to end right now. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us in the pressing room. And thank you for those of you who stayed on to continue to engage with Cheryl. We have to end now because it is time for us to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank you once again, Cheryl. We'll have to have you back in the pressing room to continue on. But I would like to thank you, those of you for joining us here in the pressing room. I'm Rosalind Frazer-Gregory, your host and founder of the pressing room. I'm also the author of Save, Single, and Pregnant and an Amazon #1 best-selling ebook, A Beginner's Guide to Giving an Effective Testimony. Again, we are always looking for speakers. We're looking for authors and entrepreneurs to tell of their story of struggle and resilience. So if you know anybody, please give them my telephone number and my email address, and I'll reach out to them. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night. God bless you all. Bye-bye. Thank you, Cheryl.